The moon clung to the desert sky like a silver bullet lodged in the heart of darkness. Wind-swept mesas stood in silent judgment, their towering forms waiting to bear witness to bloodshed that seemed as inevitable as the coming dawn. Clara's breath caught as she knelt in the swirling dust, unsure if the life she preserved this night would one day cost her own. Arizona Territory, 1876. The desert's breath, warm and suffocating, draped the land beneath a sun that showed no mercy. Cacti stood like silent sentinels scattered among jagged rocks, while distant crimson butts glowed as though from some hidden internal fire. The territory, still raw with conflict, was a place of harsh extremes, where a person's goodness could just as quickly become a fatal flaw. Out here, on a remote patch of land hugging the base of a weary mesa, Clara Hastings had chosen to stake her claim. She was a young widow of 28, hair braided tightly beneath a dusty straw hat, the ends teased loose by the wind. She wore a simple blouse and sturdy skirt fit more for the rigors of frontier survival than any notion of finery. Strands of sandy, brown hair often escaped her hat, framing a face tanned by sun, freckled by desert dust, and always set with quiet determination. She had inherited this homestead from her late husband, William, lost to a fever 3 years back. And though rumors circulated that a woman could not run a ranch without a man, she persevered out of pure, stubborn will. She wanted to turn this meager patch of desert soil into a modest yet profitable ranch, something she and William had only dreamed of in the months before he fell ill. Despite the neighbors' whispered doubts, she believed she could sustain her small herd of goats, plant a few hardy crops near the underground spring, and barter the rest in town for essentials. Each evening, she prayed that her grit and William's memory would prove enough to keep her on her feet. Loneliness weighed on her like a stone. But more than that, she feared failing where her husband had believed they could succeed. She feared being forced to abandon this land that had cost William his life, leaving with a shameful memory of a place they once deemed their future. This fear gnawed her heart each dawn she rose to tend the animals, each evening she rode into the yard exhausted. Yet beneath that fear was an emotional weight. William's last words, spoken feverishly, with trembling hands gripping hers, urging her to continue. "Make this place bloom," he had told her, voice fading. For 3 years, she clung to that vow. About a mile away in the shadow of the red rock ridges, the hush of the desert concealed another solitary figure, just as determined but burdened by a different sorrow. The man's name was Nanton. He was Apache with proud, angular features marked by the dust of too many days without shelter, and eyes that observed with profound wariness. He wore weathered buckskin leggings and a shirt torn at the shoulder, stained with blood. Yet he stood with quiet dignity, scanning the horizon for friend or foe alike. Survive. A bullet had torn through his upper arm during a skirmish with a small cavalry patrol. That brief exchange of gunfire left him wounded and separated from his band. He was trekking north to regroup with family near the mountains, hoping to find safety and medical help before infection claimed him. He feared not just the bullet lodged in his flesh, but the possibility of capture by the very men who pursued him. Soldiers, bounty hunters, vigilantes, it was all the same. He dreaded the idea of bleeding to death in the desert, alone and unmourned, for the sake of a battle that seemed endless. He had grown wary of the constant running, the heartbreak of raids, and the knowledge that his people's way of life was slipping away with each new settlement built on their lands. His emotional weight was heavier than fear of dying. In his nightmares, he saw the faces of children who cried out for fathers who would never return. He saw the scars carved into the old by sorrow and displacement. Keeping the memory of his people's pride alive felt as insurmountable a task as outrunning the cavalry. Yet he had no choice but to try. That same day, as the sun sagged low in the west, Clara prepared for her customary evening chores. Leading her goats back to their pen, she felt an unshakable sense of unease, like eyes on her back. Darkness was a fickle ally in these parts. It could cloak you as easily as betray you. She finished her tasks faster than usual, each passing minute accompanied by the unsettling cry of a hawk overhead. As night fell, she retreated inside, barred her door, and loaded her husband's old revolver, just in case. Little did she know that some 100 yards from her doorstep, Nanton lay wounded and bleeding, concealed by the lengthening shadows. Each ragged breath felt like drawing shards of glass into his lungs. He pressed a trembling hand to his wounded arm, stanching blood that refused to fully coagulate. He had risked nearing the small ranch because he glimpsed a glimmer of lantern light, perhaps water, perhaps shelter. But what if that faint hope was a death sentence? The memory of gunshots ringing through the desert thundered in his mind. Eventually, Nanton's strength waned, and he collapsed near a scraggly mesquite tree. Before unconsciousness claimed him, his thoughts drifted to the stories his grandmother used to tell of fierce desert spirits who tested the hearts of strangers passing through. Sometimes these spirits appeared as kind faces, sometimes as illusions. He whispered a final prayer in his language, hoping to greet dawn alive. Inside her cabin, Clara wrestled with anxious dreams. She dreamt of a wounded coyote scratching at her door, eyes pleading for mercy. She awoke, heart pounding, uncertain if it was a warning or an omen. Without any obvious explanation, she took her husband's revolver from the bedside and ventured onto the porch, lantern in hand. That was the moment she discovered him, a broken figure lying on the ground, the faint shape of a man. Her heart leapt into her throat. Apache. Her mind screamed caution. Stories told in town about raiding parties, the rumors of kidnappings, but fear was overshadowed by a quiet, persistent compassion. She could not simply let him die. Carefully she approached. His breathing was shallow. Blood crusted the torn fabric at his shoulder. "Sir," she whispered, uncertain if he spoke English. Can you hear me?" No answer. She knelt, pressing trembling fingers to his neck. A pulse, faint but present. Against all sensible judgment, she decided she would treat him. At the very least, give him a fighting chance. If she did nothing, he would be gone by morning. And so, with the caution of someone all too aware that a single misstep could be her undoing, Clara hefted Nanton's unresponsive form in her arms, heavier than expected, and straining, half dragged him inside. The desert remained silent, as though holding its breath. She shut the door, drawing the lock across, uncertain whether she was granting this man salvation or inviting her own doom. Clara barely slept that night. She'd placed the wounded man on her only bed and spent hours tending to his bullet wound by lamplight. Her knowledge of medicine was rudimentary at best, passed down from her mother, learned from caring for William in his final days. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and whiskey, then bandaged it in strips torn from her petticoat. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, she was slumped in a rocking chair beside him, revolver in her lap. A soft moan stirred her awake. Nanton's eyes opened, flitting around the cabin like a trapped hawk. For a moment he seemed unsure if this was life or the afterlife. When his gaze landed on Clara, fear blazed in his dark eyes. "Easy," she murmured, a firmness in her tone betraying her own anxiety. She held up a mug of water. "Drink." He eyed her, the tension in his jaw suggesting he might refuse, but thirst triumphed. He lifted himself slightly and drank, wincing as pain flared in his shoulder. That was enough to break some barrier. He sagged back against the pillows, eyes fluttering in exhaustion. They did not exchange words, though Clara offered some simple instructions, pantomiming that he should remain still. She was uncertain if he spoke any English or if he would spit at her attempts. Yet she found him to be calm, desperate, perhaps, but not hostile. She fed her goats, heart-pounding, worried at every step that a cavalry scout might come galloping over the ridge, or that she would return to find the Apache brandishing her gun. But upon re-entering the cabin, she saw him still lying there, eyes heavy, lidded with pain. That morning, they formed a fragile truce. She was caretaker, and he was helpless. If either had planned betrayal, there was no immediate sign of it, though shadows of mistrust lingered in every glance. 3 days passed. Clara made sure the animals were tended. then poured her energy into ensuring Nanton's wound did not turn gangrenous. By the third evening, the desert sky churned with storm clouds. Low rumbles of thunder underscored her growing unease. She had learned his name, Nanton. When, delirious with fever, he repeated it in his moaning. He would sometimes speak in Apache, though she understood only scattered words. Other times he spoke in halting English, enough to convey simple ideas. He discovered her name too. Clara, he repeated softly. It felt strange on his tongue, as though practicing a new language. She found it oddly comforting to hear her name from someone's lips after so much lonely time on the ranch. The bullet had exited cleanly, but infection lurked. Fever made him sweat through his bandages. She coaxed him to drink water, to swallow what little broth she could scrape together. Each time she pressed a cool cloth to his brow, she wondered if she was saving him or sealing her fate. The fear was not unspoken. It was too loud in her mind to be ignored. What if once he recovered, he signaled others? Apaches might descend on her ranch, or he might slip out and lead a cavalry patrol back. She tried to silence those thoughts by focusing on the immediate task: keep him alive. That evening, the wind howled outside, driving stinging sand against the door. Lantern light cast flickering shadows across the rough plank walls. Nanton lay still, each breath measured. Clara sat near the window, watching the storm swirl across the desert, lost in a tumult of worry and compassion. In a hesitant voice, she asked, Were you in a fight?" She gestured to his shoulder. He stared at her for a long moment. She thought he might not reply. Then, in broken English, he whispered, "Soldiers attacked my family. Kill." "Many." His voice trembled on the last word. She looked away. She had heard the rumors. Entire Apache camps uprooted, families forced to relocate, violent clashes. But hearing it in his voice eroded some layer of her ignorance. "I'm sorry." She managed, her voice thin. Thunder rattled the window as if in agreement. He watched her. She wondered if he despised her, if her white face was only a painful reminder of the men who shot him. But exhaustion overcame them both before she could ask more. The next afternoon, a new threat emerged. Clara was out by the goat pen when she spotted a dust plume on the horizon. Someone was riding toward her ranch. Heart pounding, she rushed back inside, making sure Nanton was hidden beneath blankets and out of immediate sight. She stepped onto the porch as the rider arrived, a grizzled man with unkempt hair and the dusty uniform trousers of the cavalry. His left pant leg was torn, the stripes faded. He looked half mad with thirst, and the horse beneath him looked worse off than him. A stolen horse, perhaps. He dismounted shakily. "Mornin', ma'am," he said, voice raspy. He introduced himself as Edgar Finch, a scout. His pinned stare told her he was searching for something, or someone. "I'm after a wounded Apache, name of Nanton. Real dangerous. You seen any sign of him?" Clara kept her face stony, though her pulse hammered in her ears. "No." "Sir?" she answered, adopting a forced calm. "I live alone out here. Don't get visitors." Finch studied her with watery blue eyes. "He's about your height, shot in the shoulder. You'd know if you seen him. Bleeds something awful." She made a vague shrug, praying he would not demand to look inside the cabin. "I can offer you water for your horse if you'd like," she said, gesturing toward the well behind the house. He stared for a beat longer, then spat a wad of tobacco. "That'd be kind. Army's paying a bounty on him. You happen to catch sight, you do the right thing." She offered the barest nod. Understood. He led his horse around, still sizing up her property with every step. Clara's hand remained near her revolver. She could not risk letting him near the cabin door. She insisted on drawing water for him, all while keeping her voice as neutral as possible. As he gulped from the bucket, he asked, "You out here alone? Ain't safe for a woman? Got no man about. My husband passed," she said quietly. "But I manage well enough." Finch sneered. "Suit yourself." His gaze drifted to the cabin windows, narrowed suspiciously. Time seemed to stand still. Then he jerked on the reins. "I best move on," he said. "But if you do see that Apache devil, well, best shoot first. Save yourself the trouble. Without another word, he mounted and rode off. Clara watched him go, dread pooling in her stomach. She wondered how many more like him might come. The bounty changed everything. Where once Nanton was a wounded stranger, now he was a target with a price. And by sheltering him, she had become complicit. Tension simmered in the cabin for the next 2 days. Nanton's fever broke, thanks to Clara's vigilant nursing, but the bullet wound remained a painful liability. He was strong enough to limp across the room, but would not survive a prolonged journey on foot. After the rattling encounter with Edgar Finch, Clara resolved to help Nanton reach a safer region, away from the watchful eyes of bounty hunters. A moral line had already been crossed. She had saved his life. Now, seeing the quiet gratitude in his gaze, the determination in his posture, she realized the only path forward was to commit fully. Nanton had asked if there was a pass over the mesa that might lead northward without crossing the main roads. Clara knew of a hidden canyon route, though it was fraught with steep drop-offs. If the storm season worsened, flash floods could make it impassable. She felt torn, struggling with a swirl of doubts. If she guided him, she risked exposing her ranch, her sole livelihood. If something happened to her out there, who would tend the goats or keep William's memory alive? And if she left Nanton to fend for himself, well, could she live with that guilt? On the 3rd night after Finch's visit, she stepped outside to clear her head. She found Nanton sitting on the porch, legs trembling from the effort. He gazed up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the black sky. For a moment, they simply existed side by side, 2 wary souls in a land that embraced no one without a fight. He murmured in a patch quietly, then turned to her and said in English, "I thank you." She blinked back tears she hadn't realized were gathering. "I couldn't let you die." His gaze was steady, a reflection of the burden in his soul. "Why?" She grappled for an answer. She thought of William, how she had nursed him till the end, how each life, Apache, white any color, was precious. I don't know," she said at last, "because it was the right thing to do." At that, his lips curved into the faintest smile, one tempered by sorrow. The desert wind sighed around them. Clara shivered despite the heat. She realized she might be in deeper than she had ever intended, but there was no turning back. Before dawn the next day, they set out. The plan: ride her old mule, with Clara guiding on foot for as long as the terrain was manageable. Once they reached the hidden canyon pass, Nanton would continue alone, navigating the narrower trails with the mule's sure footing. Clara would then circle back on foot, returning to her ranch before nightfall, if fortune favored them. Darkness still blanketed the land as they left the safety of her fence line. Clara carried the revolver and a canteen, plus a small pouch of food. Nanton had a makeshift sling supporting his bad arm. His posture remained upright with visible effort. He refused to show weakness, but she could see the pain in his eyes. They made slow progress beneath a purplish sky. The sun began to crest the horizon in fiery orange, revealing the endless sweep of desert before them. Silence reigned, broken only by the faint jingle of the mule's tack and the crunch of boots on rocky soil. They were 2 hours into their journey when Clara froze. On a distant rise, she spotted the glint of metal, like a spyglass or a rifle barrel catching the morning sun. She grabbed Nanton's good arm, pulling him down behind a boulder. "We're not alone," she whispered. Moments later, dust clouds erupted around them. Shots rang out, the echo ricocheting off distant cliffs. Clara's heart lurched. It had to be Finch or men like him. They had found their trail. Nanton's expression hardened. He retrieved a knife from his belt, face set. They peered over the rock to see 2 riders approaching at a full gallop, rifles raised. Clara's hands shook. She had handled William's revolver for defense against snakes and the occasional coyote, but never a man. She closed her eyes, whispered a desperate plea for courage. The riders drew closer. One fired again, the bullet sparking against stone. Clara returned fire, more to keep them at bay than out of any real skill. One rider swerved, cursing. The other pressed on, leaning in the saddle with a savage grin. Nanton rose, despite Clara's frantic gesture to stay hidden. He hurled his knife with startling precision. It lodged in the first rider's arm. The man yelped, dropping his rifle. Meanwhile, Clara found the second rider in her sights. She squeezed the trigger. The revolver thundered. The shot tore through the morning air and clipped the second rider's shoulder. He spun sideways, crashing from his horse onto the sand. The animal bolted, dust swirling. Clara stared in numb disbelief at the rising dust. A moment later, the first man yanked the knife free from his forearm, gritting his teeth. He still possessed a sidearm. He fired blindly toward the boulder. Pebbles rattled. Nanton, grimacing in pain, managed to reload Clara's revolver with trembling fingers. The man advanced warily, determined to claim his bounty. With her pulse roaring in her ears, Clara steadied her aim over the rock. The swirling dust provided partial cover. She saw the outline of the attacker approaching. She fired twice more. One bullet missed wide, but the other struck the man's leg. He crumpled with a strangled cry. Silence. After several taut moments, Nanton gestured for Clara to stay put. He crawled forward, wincing, to confirm the men were no longer a threat. The second rider lay unconscious from his fall. The first moaned in pain, clutching his wounded leg, cursing in a voice thick with rage and desperation. That was when Clara recognized him, Edgar Finch. He glared at her, voice strangled. "You bitch," he spat, "helping that savage, the army'll string you up." Clara's mind whirled. She stared at the blood pooling in the dust beneath Finch's leg, torn between horror and an odd sense of pity. She had shot a man. And yet, to protect herself and Nanton, what choice did she have? She knelt beside him, ignoring the fury in his eyes. "Don't move," she ordered. She tore a strip from her own blouse to wrap his wound. He hissed in pain. "You're a fool," he whispered. "An Apache lover's as good as dead in these parts." She pressed her lips together, saying nothing. She finished binding the wound, leaving him stable enough not to bleed out on the spot. The second man remained unconscious but breathing. She could do nothing more for either without sacrificing her own life. She and Nanton had to leave, and fast. They took the second man's horse, since Finch's horse had fled. Clara handed Nanton the reins of the mule, and she mounted the stolen horse. Her hands trembled on the saddle horn. "One need to ride," she said. Nanton nodded, face pallid. They set off, hearts pounding, leaving 2 wounded men in their dust. For the first time, Clara fully realized the magnitude of what she had done. This was no longer a subtle act of mercy. This was outright rebellion against the powers that roamed these deserts. The sun was merciless overhead, sapping their strength. Clara's mouth felt like cotton. Each hour that passed seemed an eternity, the raw adrenaline from the ambush slowly wearing off. She could sense Nanton weakening from renewed blood loss. His bandage had blood through at the edges. And though she tried not to think about it, the possibility of a larger patrol tracking them gnawed at her mind. At midday they reached the mouth of the hidden canyon, a narrow gap between towering red walls strewn with jagged stones. The interior was cooler than the open desert, but no less foreboding. A single misstep could sprain an ankle or send one tumbling off the ledges. The canyon twisted deeper toward the mountains, eventually emerging on the far side in safer territory for Nanton, or so Clara hoped. They walked the animals carefully over loose rock. She paused by a trickle of a spring that seeped from a crack in the canyon wall, letting the mule and horse drink their fill. Nanton slumped against the stone, sweat glistening on his brow. She cleaned his wound with fresh water, rewrapped the bandage, and forced him to sip from the canteen. He shivered, though the sun still poured heat into the canyon. "You need rest," she said. He nodded slowly. "Can't," he murmured. "We must go further." He was right, but she could see how close he was to collapse. As they pressed on, the canyon floor narrowed. They passed ancient petroglyphs etched into the walls, images of spirals, animals, and mythical figures. Nanton traced one with his fingertips in passing, as if drawing strength from his ancestors. With each step, Clara felt she walked deeper into a land of ghosts, echoes of a people who had lived here long before she or any settler had come. The silent reverence was abruptly shattered. Hoofbeats echoed from behind them, reverberating off stone. Another ambush seemed imminent. Clara and Nanton exchanged stricken glances. In a flurry of hooves, two figures emerged from around a bend in the canyon. But these were not cavalry. They were Apache. One older man with hair bound high, a second younger warrior with a rifle across his back. At the sight of Nanton, they reined in sharply. Tense silence fell. Nanton spoke in hurried Apache. The older warrior's gaze flicked to Clara, suspicion etched across his face. She felt her heart race. If these were Nanton's kin, perhaps they would spare her. But if they saw her as a trespassing outsider, the old man dismounted, stepping forward with measured caution. He reached for Nanton's bandage, gently examining the wound. A string of fierce words passed between them. Clara understood none of it, but she recognized relief in the older man's eyes as he clasped Nanton's good hand. Then the younger warrior advanced, eyes cold. He pointed at Clara, spat an Apache phrase that bristled with anger. Nanton responded, shaking his head firmly, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. The tension was palpable. She guessed the younger man wanted to know why a white woman stood among them. In this canyon, an outsider was an intruder. Nanton's brow furrowed. He spoke again, voice raw with fatigue. He gestured to his wound, to Clara, then to the mouth of the canyon behind them. The older man placed a hand on the younger's arm, a calming gesture. Slowly, he turned to Clara and spoke in rough English. "Yo help Nanton." She nodded, voice catching in her throat. "Yes, I found him wounded." A long silence stretched as the old warrior studied her. Clara wondered if he noticed the dried blood on her clothing, the trembling in her shoulders. Finally he nodded, though no smile crossed his weathered face. "You have done what few would." He stepped aside, gesturing for Clara to pass, as though honoring her. But the younger warrior glared, turning away. Nanton murmured that the two men were from his band. They would guide him the rest of the way. Clara felt a wave of relief, though it was tinged with sudden sadness. She realized it was time to part ways. This was the best outcome, yet it tugged at something inside her. They had shared fear and trust, forging a bond in the heat of danger. Now their paths diverged. She slipped off her horse. "Take it," she said gently, though she felt a pang for the poor stolen animal. "You need to travel faster than on the mule, and you'll recover better if you don't have to walk." Nanton looked at her, surprised, perhaps uncertain if it was safe for her to be on foot. She forced a smile. "I'll manage. It's not far to my ranch from here. I can make it back by nightfall." She offered him the remaining food in the canteen. He accepted, his eyes full of gratitude. For a moment, he stood in front of her as if struggling for words. Finally, in his halting English, he said, "Yo gave me life. My people not forget. I." He faltered, then spoke something in Apache. The old man nodded solemnly, repeating it, and from the tone Clara guessed it was a blessing. "Thank you," she whispered. She pressed a hand to his good shoulder, resisting the surge of tears. They had known each other mere days, but in that short time they'd crossed a bridge of fear and distrust that few dared cross. The older warrior guided the horse away, and the younger warrior tugged on the mule's reins, ignoring Clara. Nanton limped after them, glancing back at her once, a silent farewell. Then they rounded a bend in the canyon and were gone. Clara stood alone in the hush of that ancient place, the sun climbing overhead. She exhaled a shaky breath, uncertain if she would ever see Nanton again. But something inside her felt lighter, as if, despite the violence and danger, they had found a small moment of shared humanity. She retraced her steps, weaving through the canyon's rocky corridors. The afternoon heat pressed down on her, exhaustion clawing at her limbs. She stumbled several times, dust coating her skirt. Each step reminded her of the risk she had taken. Bounty hunters might be waiting. Finch and his cohort could have found reinforcements. Or her own goat ranch could be a smoking ruin if they'd decided on retribution. Halfway back, she began to suspect she was being followed. She paused, hearing a scrape of rock behind her. She spun, revolver raised, nothing. The hair on her neck prickled. Continuing more cautiously, she turned a corner and nearly ran into a man standing in her path. Her heart plummeted. Edgar Finch, pale, wounded but alive, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. His eyes gleamed with vengeful madness. "Thought you could leave me to rot, huh?" he rasped. She swallowed, adrenaline spiking. She aimed the revolver at him, but her hands trembled. "Stay back," she warned. Finch laughed a bitter, ragged sound. "You cost me a bounty. You shot me. You're harboring Apaches. Turn yourself in, maybe I'll let you live." He jabbed the air with his crutch for emphasis. Clara's mind whirled. He must have tracked her, driven by fury. She took a step back, boots scraping over loose gravel. He lunged, swinging the crutch. She stumbled, losing her aim. The blow glanced off her left arm, sending pain shooting up to her shoulder. She bit back a cry, fighting for control of the gun. With a snarl, Finch tore at her wrist, trying to wrench the revolver free. They grappled, his breath hot and rancid in her face. She twisted, ramming an elbow into his chest. He staggered but refused to relinquish his iron grip. In the scuffle, the revolver fired into the air, echoing through the canyon. The shot startled them both. Finch used the moment's distraction to tear the gun from her grasp and toss it aside. She gasped, fear coiling in her belly. She was defenseless. He pinned her against a rock, face contorted with rage. "Any last words?" he growled, searching for something. A knife, a hidden pistol. But Clara had only carried the one revolver. She tried to knee him, anything to break free, but his weight pressed her painfully into the stone. Then a voice boomed from behind them, echoing against the red walls. "Don't move." Another figure stepped forward, rifle at the ready. For an instant, Clara thought it was a cavalry soldier, but in the harsh glare of the sun, she recognized the older Apache warrior from before. He must have circled back. Finch froze, shifting just enough for Clara to push him away and scramble out of reach. The Apache man advanced, rifle trained on Finch's chest. Finch's eyes darted wildly. "You savage," he hissed. But the old warrior cut him off with a guttural command in Apache. Clara guessed he was telling Finch to back off or be shot. Still reeling, Clara grabbed her revolver from the ground. She leveled it at Finch, chest heaving. The old warrior's gaze flicked to her, as if giving her the choice. Would she kill him? The question hammered in her head. Was this her moment for retribution, to eliminate the threat once and for all? Time slowed. She thought of Nanton, of the bullets they had exchanged to protect each other. She thought of how Finch would not hesitate to kill her if the roles were reversed. Justice or mercy? Her hand shook. She lowered the gun. She turned to the warrior, voice trembling. "Leave him with nothing. He can hobble away or die trying in the desert." She leveled her gaze at Finch. "I won't stain my hands any further." She had killed men to defend her life once already. She could not do it again unless she had to, but she would not save him from the desert either. The warrior's expression was unreadable, but he nodded. He gestured Finch away with a jab of his rifle. Finch, white-faced and seething, spat at the ground. "Damn you all," he hissed. But fear crept into his eyes. Without a mount, water, or weapon, the desert would be merciless. He began a limping shuffle away, muttering curses. Clara's knees threatened to buckle. She braced a hand against the rock, fighting nausea. The Apache man slung his rifle over his shoulder and regarded her with quiet respect. "You spared him," he said in accented English. "Yet he will likely die out here?" She swallowed. Maybe that's his fate. A flicker of sadness crossed her face. "I only wanted to keep my home to save a wounded man." She couldn't reconcile how violent it had all become. He bowed his head. "You have a good heart," he said softly. "The desert demands blood, but you gave mercy. Now go home. You did enough." She nodded, tears hot on her cheeks. She watched him disappear back into the maze of stone, once again marveling at how swiftly and silently the Apache could move. Then she steeled herself and continued her trek. By the time she reached her ranch near dusk, the western sky blood orange. Her goats bleated in greeting, miraculously unscathed. She warily secured them for the night, stowed her gear, and collapsed by her hearth. In the dim cabin, She gazed upon the empty bed where Nanton had lain. Silence enveloped her like a shroud. She had survived, she had saved a man's life, and in doing so, she had witnessed the depths of cruelty and the heights of compassion, on both sides of the struggle. Whatever tomorrow held, she felt changed. Maybe all of the territory was set against her now. Maybe not. But something deeper had been set in motion, a bond that no bullet could break, forged in the darkest hours of the desert. The frontier has a way of sharpening our choices until they cut to the very bone of who we are. Faced with fear, we can let it twist into hatred, or let compassion guide us across the jagged spaces that divide us. In the end, one small act of mercy can echo across an unforgiving land, leaving ripples of hope in its wake. Thank you for listening to this tale of courage, compassion, and the high stakes of mercy. If it touched your heart or stirred your thoughts, please like, subscribe, and let us know what you think in the comments. Your support keeps these frontier stories alive.